deeply embarrassed. After all, she was about to marry a man she had never met, and yet her last night of being single had turned into a disaster. Luis, expressionless, casually got dressed and tossed her a black card worth $5 million. His cold words cut through the air. "Service fee. Take it." He mistakenly believed Susan was a gold digger from a nightclub. Susan trembled with rage, but before she could lash out, her alarm rang, reminding her to rush to the wedding venue. What Susan didn't know was that the man waiting to marry her was none other than Luis, the man who had just humiliated her. Luis, forced into this marriage by his grandfather Alex, despised the arrangement. He believed this so-called bride had schemed to manipulate his grandfather. Having never met her, he didn't even know her name. At the wedding, Luis coldly announced, "The wedding is canceled." However, Alex was well prepared. He had already secured their marriage certificate without their consent. Before Susan could even get a good look at her husband, Alex swiftly took the certificate and kept it himself. Though Alex handed Susan a black card with no spending limit, she chose to rely on herself. Susan went for a job interview at a new company. In a rush, she stumbled into an elevator and accidentally fell into Luis's arms. Luis immediately recognized her as the woman from that night. His misunderstanding deepened, arrogantly assuming Susan was stalking him. To Susan's shock, Luis turned out to be her interviewer. Luis didn't believe this gold digger had any real professional skills, and the two exchanged sharp words. Susan had no intention of continuing the interview. At that moment, design director Bess entered with a design draft for Luis to review. Susan glanced at the draft and instinctively blurted out, "This is Anna's work. You're plagiarizing." Luis and Bess didn't believe her since the design had never been released, and renowned designer Anna had been missing for a year. Luis coldly instructed Bess to contact Anna's assistant for verification. Soon, Susan's claim was confirmed. The design was indeed Anna's registered work. Luis began to see Susan in a new light. He hadn't expected her to have real talent. Susan was hired, but Bess harbored resentment. The exposed design was something Bess had paid a high price for. Seeking revenge, Bess deliberately assigned Susan to handle a perverted client. Naively thinking that polite socializing and playing golf would secure the deal, Susan was caught off guard. The client had sinister intentions, sneaking into the locker room to assault her. Susan soon felt her body heating up, realizing she had been drugged. Desperately struggling, she stumbled out of the locker room and collapsed into Luis's arms. Seeing Susan unconscious, Luis was consumed with fury. On the spot, he coldly declared, "Cancel all business with them." He turned to his assistant and ordered, "I want to hear news of their bankruptcy." Susan slowly regained consciousness, her mind still clouded by the effects of the drug. Instinctively, she wrapped her arms around Luis and softly murmured, "Husband." Luis froze for a moment, nearly losing control. His expression darkened as he swiftly carried Susan into the bathtub and turned on the shower. In a cold voice, he ordered, "Look closely at who I am." But Susan's soft call of "husband" completely shattered Luis's self-restraint. The next second, passion overwhelmed them, and they shared an intense, lingering kiss. When Susan fully woke up and saw the disheveled room, panic surged through her. Luis approached her with a cold expression and sneered, "Nothing happened. You're married, yet you still play around like this? Aren't you afraid your husband will find out?" Suppressing her panic, Susan calmly responded, "It was just an accident." They parted on bad terms, both filled with unresolved tension. Meanwhile, Bess, seeing Susan unharmed, gnashed her teeth in frustration. Noticing Luis's growing attention towards Susan, her jealousy deepened. By chance, Bess saw Susan chatting with Alex and mistakenly assumed this older man was Susan's wealthy benefactor. Eager to stir trouble, she exaggerated the situation and reported it to Luis, insinuating that Susan was living a scandalous life. Luis's expression turned cold as he spotted Susan and Alex talking in the distance. Seizing the opportunity, Bess began spreading rumors that Susan was entertaining older men. Luis, irritated, snapped, "Shut up." Despite the rumors, Susan's exceptional design work once again impressed Luis. Breaking company norms, he promoted Susan to chief designer and arranged for her to represent the company in an upcoming competition. Louise, still probing, teased coldly, "A contestant's character is important too. You're not sugar babying some rich guy, being a mistress, or wrecking any families, right?" Susan immediately and firmly denied his insinuation, her conviction unwavering. Louise, satisfied with her response, felt his mood improve. One late night, Susan was about to leave after working overtime when she accidentally bumped into Louise. Louise glanced at the design drafts in her hand and couldn't help but praise, "Your style is so similar to the famous Anna." At that moment, Susan received a dinner delivery arranged by Alex. Louise instantly recognized the luxury restaurant packaging and mocked, "Still tangled up with him, huh?" Susan answered Alex's call right then, and Louise's fury intensified as he watched her speak so affectionately. Later, Susan, hoping to hitch a ride home with Louise, was coldly rejected as he drove off without a word. But when rain started pouring, Louise couldn't bear it and turned back to pick her up. Noticing Susan struggling with her seatbelt, Louise leaned over and buckled it for her. Seeing her soaked, Louise took her to a shopping mall. Louise meticulously picked out outfits for Susan, teasingly making her try on clothes while the store staff watched their playful exchange with amusement. Only when Susan wore an outfit Louise personally chose did he finally stop his childish antics. Suddenly, a man rushed in and hugged Susan, exclaiming, "Anna, I finally found you." Louise immediately yanked the man away. Susan, startled, insisted she didn't know him. Louise protectively wrapped his arm around her and led her away. Susan casually remarked, "That guy did look a little familiar." Her words infuriated Louise. He mocked, "Oh? Do you think every handsome guy looks familiar to you? Just like that night at the bar." Susan hurriedly explained, "I mean, you looked familiar too. But I had a car accident and lost my memory." After dropping Susan off at her apartment, Louise suddenly felt the neighborhood looked oddly familiar. It struck him that he owned a property here. Looking up, he noticed the lights were on in his unit, sparking suspicion. Without hesitation, Louise hurried into the building. Meanwhile, Susan was leisurely soaking in the bathtub, completely unaware that Louise was heading straight for her place. Wrapped in a towel after her bath, Susan stepped out of the bathroom and was startled to see Louise standing in her living room. She let out a terrified scream and slipped, falling to the floor. Louise, equally shocked, demanded, "Why are you here?" Susan, confused, explained, "I rented this place." In reality, Alex had secretly gifted this apartment to Susan. Louise mistakenly assumed the property management company had rented out his apartment without permission. Embarrassed, he quickly apologized for overreacting. Suddenly, Susan fainted in his arms, catching Louise off guard. Louise stayed by Susan's side, carefully tending to her. As he watched over her, his emotions became increasingly complicated. There was something about Susan that drew him in. Louise nearly leaned in to kiss her, but his rational mind stopped him. She was a married woman. He couldn't cross that line. Susan's phone rang. Louise instinctively answered it. When Susan woke up, she panicked, snatching the phone away and hastily explaining to Alex before hanging up. Louise smirked and teased, "What's wrong?" "Afraid your grandfather will find out you've got a man in your house." Susan quickly clarified her relationship with Grandpa. It turned out that this grandpa was her husband's own grandfather, who had saved Susan's life and then made his grandson Susan's husband. But in fact, Susan had never met her husband, nor did she even know his appearance or name. Louise calmly told Susan, "If you want a divorce, you can come to me." But Louise could no longer suppress his feelings. He almost confessed that their passionate night at the bar had been his first time. Susan, however, casually responded that she didn't remember that night and advised Louise to forget it too. Back at the company, Bess acted like a typical office bully, tormenting Susan for her own amusement. One day, an exhausted Susan accidentally spilled coffee on Louise while zoning out. Unexpectedly, Louise didn't mind at all. Instead, he stared at her calmly and said, "If you want a divorce, come to me anytime." Later, Louise thoughtfully ordered dinner for Susan, secretly hoping she'd invite him to join her. But Susan was too preoccupied with herself to notice his efforts, leaving Louise quietly frustrated at his failed plan. By chance, Bess stumbled upon Susan's stunning competition design. Jealous of its brilliance, she convinced herself that such an outstanding work must belong to her. Bess then schemed with her subordinates to frame Susan for theft and had her fired. However, Alex happened to witness this setup firsthand and immediately defended Susan. Unaware of Alex's true identity, Bess recklessly insulted him, causing Alex to collapse in anger. While Susan was busy caring for Alex at the hospital, Bess stole Susan's design and presented it at the exhibition as her own. Upon learning this, Susan rushed to the event. Meanwhile, Luis, hurrying to the hospital to check on his grandfather, unknowingly passed by Susan, missing a crucial chance to reconnect. At the exhibition, Susan boldly presented her digital drafts, publicly proving the design was her original work. Luis arrived just in time to back her up, firmly standing by Susan's side. Enraged and humiliated, Bess lost control and shoved the display towards Susan. Luis quickly intervened, pulling Susan out of harm's way. Worried about her health, Luis didn't hesitate to carry Susan bridal style to the hospital. Susan thought Luis would fire Bess immediately, but he apologized and explained why he hadn't. Bess had once saved Luis's life during a car accident, and he felt indebted to her. To make it up to Susan, Luis promoted her to design director on the spot. Not long after, Susan received a pressuring call from Alex, urging her to have children. Feeling helpless, she vented to Luis. Luis immediately tightened his grip on her arm and said, "If you don't like his grandson, just divorce him. I'll help you." Susan raised an eyebrow and teased, "Why are you so nervous? Don't tell me you've fallen for me." Luis froze, unable to deny it, but before he could respond, Alex called him, demanding he come home for dinner with his wife. After hanging up, Luis scoffed, "My grandpa's being played like a fool by some scheming woman." Seeing their mutual frustration, Luis suggested they pretend to be a couple so he could explain things to his grandfather and smoothly get a divorce. On her way to the dinner, Susan was accidentally hit by a serving cart but was saved in time. When she regained consciousness, her memories returned. She was actually the missing renowned designer, Anna. The man who saved her was her former assistant, Mu Fei. Mu Fei casually answered Luis's call and briefly informed him that Susan was in the hospital before hanging up. Luis rushed to the hospital, only to see Mu Fei holding Susan, mistakenly assuming he was Susan's husband. A flicker of disappointment crossed Luis's face, and he quietly turned to leave. Susan finally realized why Luis seemed so familiar. She was the one who had saved him during his car accident, not Bess. Bess had stolen the credit for saving Luis, using it to gain his trust. Meanwhile, Luis was drowning his sorrows at a bar, tormented by the image of Susan in Mu Fei's arms. Drunk and vulnerable, Luis let his guard down. Bess seized the chance, drugging Luis in an attempt to violate him and force a relationship. Luis fought to stay conscious and ultimately shoved Bess away. With the last of his strength, he called Susan. "Help me." Susan rushed to Luis's side, gently caring for him. When Luis woke up, he finally confessed his feelings to her. Moved by his sincerity, Susan responded, and they shared a deep, passionate kiss. However, Susan quietly left the next morning, planning to confess everything to Alex and proceed with the divorce. Unbeknownst to her, Bess secretly entered Luis's room after she left. Luis's attitude towards Susan took a drastic turn. He firmly believed that the woman who accompanied him that night was Susan, only to discover it was actually Bess. This misunderstanding ignited his fury. Luis mistakenly thought Susan had tricked him into being with Bess. Unaware of this, Susan was shopping at the mall when she saw Bess flaunting Luis's black card. This infuriated Susan, especially when Luis deliberately left with Bess in front of her. Luis had given Bess the black card in an attempt to sever ties with her, but Bess shamelessly used it to show off. To spite Susan, Luis publicly acted intimate with Bess. Before Susan could dwell in her disappointment, she suddenly received shocking news. Anna was coming to Luis's company for a collaboration. However, when Susan met the so-called Anna, it turned out to be her former assistant impersonating her. The assistant, parading around as Anna, was stunned to see Susan. To uncover the assistant's scheme, Susan pretended not to recognize her and secretly observed her actions. What Susan didn't expect was that her former assistant had grown ruthless. She secretly ordered Susan's abduction. Meanwhile, Luis received news of Susan's kidnapping and immediately launched a rescue mission. During the process, Luis finally uncovered the truth about that fateful night. At the critical moment, Luis saved Susan. Overwhelmed by relief and emotions, they shared a passionate kiss. This time, fully conscious, they sincerely confessed their feelings for each other. Susan revealed her true identity and the fact that she was the one who saved Luis years ago. With nothing left hidden between them, Susan and Luis rushed to the company. At the same time, Mu Fei arrived with the police. The truth was exposed. The former assistant had orchestrated Susan's car accident. She was arrested on the spot and would face legal consequences. Simultaneously, Bess was also brought to justice. Not only had she drugged Luis, but it was revealed that she was a corporate spy planted by a rival company. The evidence was irrefutable. Alex later invited both Susan and Luis to visit him at the hospital. When Susan arrived as his granddaughter-in-law, the truth finally came to light. Luis was the faceless man Susan had mentioned, and Susan was the scheming woman Luis had misunderstood. All misunderstandings unraveled in that moment. Though they initially resisted the marriage, the misunderstandings and twists of fate brought them closer, and they truly fell in love with each other.